The reality is that we have an unprecedented humanitarian and security crisis on our border.
60,000 children taken into custody at the border in the last 6 weeks alone.
We need to close these loopholes and get control of our border.
Around this country, including my state of Florida, and we're not on the border, they want border security.
I think this is truly a humanitarian crisis. I hope our friends on the other side, the Democrats, will step up and join us.
We really are calling on Democrats, work with us. This is not a manufactured crisis. This is a problem we have to solve, and it's growing out of control.
The breaking point has long passed at the border. This is not sustainable. It's not fair to those who wear the uniform of the United States.
The security of our country and the well-being of tens of thousands of immigrants are at stake. And Democrats are refusing to address the situation because they don't like the president.
This situation is not sustainable for the United States, and this administration is committed to securing the border.
Our Democratic colleagues continue to pretend that there is not a problem.
Our Border Patrol agents are spending more time caring for these migrants than they are patrolling our border, which is their core function.
We've got to provide them relief. We've got to stop talking past everybody and recognize there's a humanitarian crisis, there's a public health crisis.
We have to surge resources to this area to end this crisis.
It is time for the Democrats to engage, to work with us. The time for action on immigration is now.
So I'm going to bring it up freestanding next week and see if they really aren't interested in dealing with this massive humanity that we have to take care of.
It's been a full 7 weeks now that President Trump has been asking Congress to act on the humanitarian crisis at the border, but yet the Democrats continue to obstruct. They seem to rather fight with the president than fix the problem that is real and getting worse. When you take a look at the numbers, you're talking about 4,000 migrants stopped per day. We're on a pace to get to 1 million this year, which would be double last year's number, and yet Senator Schumer and Speaker Pelosi have called this a manufactured crisis. The Democrats have been AWOL on this. Republicans are ready to act. There's going to be a bill in the Appropriations Committee coming forward. I hope it's accepted in a bipartisan way, but the Democrats' action on this has been reckless and wrong.
Good afternoon. This hearing is called to order. I apologize that we are slightly delayed. We had a series of votes on the Senate floor, but it is good now to convene the hearing. Let me begin by thanking all of you for attending and thanking Senator Hirono for working with me and my staff to convene this hearing and bring these witnesses together. The topic before us is one I believe of great importance: the need for term limits for members of Congress so that we can begin to fix what is broken here in Washington politics. Before I introduce our first panel, I'd like to explain why we've organized today's hearing. The 2016 election, the American people made a resounding call to drain the swamp that is modern Washington. And sadly, this is a bipartisan problem. The American people have lost confidence in Washington, and especially in Congress. And it isn't hard to see why. Enmeshed in backroom deals and broken promises, our capital has too often become a political playground for the powerful and the well-connected, for members of the permanent political class looking to accumulate more and more power at the expense of American taxpayers. As part of his promise to drain the swamp, President Trump strongly endorsed and campaigned on passing congressional term limits. Though our founders didn't include term limits in the Constitution, they feared the creation of a permanent political class that existed parallel to rather than within American society. As Benjamin Franklin observed, quote, "In free governments, the rulers are the servants, and the people their superiors. For the former, therefore, to return among the latter was not to degrade, but to promote them." The fears of the framers have today been realized. Today, the swamp is hard at work, picking winners and losers. with hardworking Americans typically winding up on the losing end. Every year, Congress spends billions of dollars on giveaways for the well-connected. Washington insiders get taxpayer money, members of Congress get reelected, and the system works for everyone except the American people. This kind of self-interest builds on itself as members spend more and more time in office. In an age in which the partisan divides seem intractable, it is remarkable that public support for congressional term limits remains strong across party lines. In poll after poll conducted over decades, Americans who are Republicans, who are Democrats, who are independents, Americans who are conservatives, who are liberals, who are moderates, who are men, who are women, who are Anglo-American, who are African-American, who are Hispanic, all support term limits by overwhelming margins. For example, a 2018 McLaughlin and Associates poll found that 82% of Americans support term limits for Congress, including 89% of Republicans, but also 76% of Democrats support term limits. 83% of independents support term limits. 72% of Hispanics support term limits. And 70% of African Americans support term limits. Indeed, the one group, it seems, in America that doesn't support term limits are career politicians here in Washington. Everybody else recognizes the problem. A 2016 Rasmussen poll showed much the same thing, as did a 2013 Gallup poll. These results have been consistent year after year after year. Ending that dynamic of Congress enriching insiders and using those insiders to hold on to powers favors neither party. It's not a problem of just Republicans or just Democrats. Restoring confidence and accountability in Congress shouldn't be the business of just one party or of just this committee or even of just the Senate. It concerns all Americans, whatever your politics. So why hasn't Congress acted already? It's straightforward. Too many career politicians don't want to restrict their own power, and neither party wants to act on its own. Still, the American people recognize that congressional term limits would help fix the brokenness and corruption fostered by career politicians in Washington today. At our founding, representatives left their homes, their farms, their businesses. They traveled to Washington to represent their constituents. They served in Congress for a time, but usually returned to their homes and their affairs. Leaders like George Washington and John Adams and James Madison reached the height of political power and then relinquished it to return to public life, private life. But today, members of Congress aren't doing that. Instead, far too many of our politicians come to Washington to stay. Too much of Washington's business is dictated by career politicians, by bureaucrats, and by lobbyists who spend time as one or the other. The rise of political careerism in modern Washington is a sharp departure from what the founders intended in our federal governing bodies, to effectively drain the swamp and to end the phenomenon of career politicians. It is long past time to enact term limits for Congress. I am the author of a constitutional amendment that would limit U.S. senators to 2 6-year terms and would limit members of the House of Representatives to 3 2-year terms. At this point, we currently have 14 co-sponsors in the Senate. It is my hope that this hearing today will help explain why we should come together, Republicans and Democrats across party lines, to enact term limits to protect the American people. The Senate, I believe, should take up and vote on the term limits amendment that I've introduced. And if Congress will simply listen to the American people, to the overwhelming majorities across party lines that want to see term limits, which we have for the president, see term limits also for Congress, then we can rest confidence that the states would quickly ratify that amendment. The only impediment is the United States Congress. And I hope that this hearing and the panel that we have to get to today, the two panels, will help move that discussion forward. With that, I recognize Senator Hirono for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for being here. I'm pleased that so far today we've had some discussion already about the importance of federalism, about the concept that we don't have a single system of government in our country. We've got a multi-layer system in which some power is reserved to the federal government and other powers are reserved for the states and their political subdivisions or to the people, as it's stated in the 10th Amendment. We've seen a number of concerning reports about drones flying in airspace where they probably shouldn't be, above crowded stadiums, sometimes smuggling contraband into prisons and near airports, including takeoff and landing space. And so drone threats extend beyond the interests that are necessarily purely and obviously federal. They end up affecting the same set of interests that our state and local laws and our state and local law enforcement should be concerned about as well. So, Ms. Stubblefield, I've got some questions for you on this. Is the FAA or any other federal law enforcement agency or any other federal agency of any kind for that matter in a position to directly mitigate any and every reckless or criminal misuse of a drone?
So I'll try to answer that in a couple different ways. There are authorities that have been given to 4 federal departments to be able to mitigate, that is, disrupt, destroy, damage, take down a UAS, and that's the Department of Defense, Energy, Homeland Security, and Justice.
Right.
They've been given those authorities for very specific mission sets, largely for the protection of national security assets, although DHS and Justice do have the authority, if requested by a state executive, to provide that support to a mass gathering if requested.
Right, right, and it's important that they have that, but it's neither realistic nor the stated objective of the federal government to say there can never be any circumstance in which a state and local government law enforcement agency wouldn't need to respond. Right? I mean, surely federal agencies won't be able to handle every one of these issues, and surely there are interests that are non-federal that also need to be taken into account. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
And so in that respect, drone integration probably isn't possible without state and local police being able to act in real time and in order to address threats that arise from time to time with drone usage. Would you agree with that?
We certainly need a robust security framework to support and enable full UAS integration, absolutely. Remote identification, we think, which we're working very hard on to get that rule out later this year, is focused on giving that information so that when a law enforcement officer sees a UAS that they believe is not in a place that it should be, they will have the ability to identify something about that UAS and where its operator control station is, to be able to then go and engage that operator, determine what their intent is their operation legal, and to get that aircraft, that UAS down and out of potential harm's way if that's what it's creating a safety risk.
How does the FAA believe that local or any other non-federal police should be able to respond to drone incidents that take place in this sort of low-altitude space? Won't there need to be some non-federal agencies that have counter-UAS capabilities?
The challenge with counter-UAS capabilities currently is the technology that enables that type of activity has significant impacts on the national airspace system and on other types of communications capabilities, particularly in urban environments. So right now, because that technology is civilly challenging to implement without a high degree of coordination, which is what's been required for federal agencies to be able to use it, it's challenging to to consider the ability of state and local law enforcement to be able to do that without potentially creating even greater safety impacts while they're trying to address a security risk.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I've got one additional question. Can I carry that out? One of the stated purposes of the UAS integration pilot program was to test and to evaluate various models of state, local, and tribal enforcement in the development enforcement of federal regulations for UAS operations. This includes the testing of reasonable time, place, and manner limitations on low-altitude UAS operations. Can you tell me specifically how the FAA has started testing these reasonable time, place, and manner limitations in the context of state and local law enforcement response?
So, well, fundamentally, the FAA manages the airspace. We try to work very hard with all of the stakeholders, to include our state and local law enforcement, whom we have an entire program, our law enforcement assistance program, dedicated to providing support, education, and assistance to law enforcement. However, we have not, within the context of the IPP, had any requests for time, place, or manner restrictions, so we've not been able to really test that activity. Right now, as we look at what a future UTM might look like with something like remote identification, which is going to give a tremendous amount of information to state and local law enforcement, as we look at something that might enable the ability in the future with some type of dynamic airspace where a local law enforcement officer who currently calls up the FAA if there's an accident or wants to have some sort of airspace restriction to enable a security response of some sort, where that might be something that could be done in an automated fashion, such as how we do with airspace authorizations today. Those are the types of things that we envision potentially in a UTM framework going forward. Right now, we work that sort of on a case-by-case basis with law enforcement engaging the FAA to provide that restriction as necessary to support those response activities.
Okay, thank you. I'm out of time. Let me just say, I think we've established in our conversation here today that it is important to integrate state and local law enforcement personnel. We can't do it without them. We can't mitigate these threats without them. That being the case, I think it's not just a possibility or a potentiality, a hypothetical question off in the future. I think it's absolutely essential that we test the local police, that we test this in your evaluation, that we start testing reasonable time, place, and manner limitations in the context of state and local law enforcement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.